Hello, fictional. Welcome to the Fiction Series X. Today we are gonna see what if Issei meets with the Kendo girls. Part 8. If you end up liking this video, please consider subscribe, so without further ado, let's get into the video. Issei never held the same disdain for Monday that the rest of the school seemed to. Today especially, he was up and ready to go. Sure, school sucked, but the people around him made it enjoyable. His date with Reya's yesterday and the events with Yui last night revitalized him. Sitting at the table, surprisingly, was all 5 residents of the Haidu household. His father was seated at the head, sipping on his coffee and reading the paper before heading to work. His mother had just taken the spot to his right after placing their breakfast on the table. She looked especially pleased, seeing a full table all ready to dig into her labors. She had been watching carefully, making sure that her husband didn't have any more outbursts, especially not with the girls at the table. He'd been better lately, but it was better safe than sorry. She didn't want to be caught off guard like that again. The hot frying pan in her hand had almost met the top of his head when Issei walked into the room. He wasn't even facing the same direction as their son, but somehow knew Issei was there. His face twisted into a scowl as Issei clipped on the bracelet she was sure he'd lost ages ago. Just as quick as that scowl formed, it was gone, and she let the pan back down to the stove. "Hey Dad, how long is this project supposed to last anyway?" Issei asked once he sat down at the opposite end, Yui and Kaori to each of his sides. Setting the mug down on the table, Koji lowered the paper to speak with his son. "Not a clue, every time we think all the details are finalized, the buyer changes one detail or another. What they need 500 different material compositions is beyond me," he answered before going back to the paper. His father was an acquisition specialist. He handled larger orders brought in, seeking the materials or services for whatever their customer needed. This particular order had been in the works for a while now. It sounded like it originated from a cosplay company. They wanted mock armor pieces, staffs of different and specific designs, eyeglasses, shields, swords. Every item on the list had a very specific material composition to it. His father seemed to be having a hard time finding places to make all of it within a reasonable amount of time. "You're leaving already? Don't your classes start at 9? It's only 7:45. His mother asked as Issei stood up, grabbing his plate to be cleaned. The others were all still in the middle of their meal. The 2 girls didn't look like they were planning to head out anytime soon either. The walk to Kuo Academy only took 20 minutes, and that's if you had to stop at each and every intersection for traffic. Rinsing the plate off to clean easier, Issei turned towards his family. "Yay, I have to meet up with the VP. We're handing out evil forms to all the classes to get input on how the co-ed thing is working. They need to be filed and tallied before the summer break." Setting her utensils down, his mother tapped her chin, curious about something about his school that she hadn't heard about yet. "It sounds like the vice president does all the work. Where is the president in all of this?" Drying his hands off with the freshly washed hand towels, Issei walked to the fridge to grab a bottle of water to go. On some sort of study abroad program apparently. She's supposed to be coming back for the fall term. What was her name again? Issei twirled the bracelet around his wrist, something he did when lost in thought. Ayla something ballet? No, Billow. Billy's. He stood there, the women of the house watching him try to remember, when Mr. Haidu spoke without really thinking about what the outcome would be. Bilet. Snapping his fingers, giving a thankful smile towards his father for helping him get the name right. It wouldn't do for him to not know who the leader of the student council technically was. "That's it. Wait, how'd you know that? Is she well known or something?" Slamming down the last quarter cup of coffee he had, Koji Haidu scrambled to get himself out of there before too many questions could be asked. "Would you look at the time? Better head to work. Love you honey, see you later kids." Only grabbing his wallet and keys, he bolted out of the front door like a man possessed, forgetting his briefcase that held the details of what he needed to work on this morning. Kaori and Yui glanced from Issei to the direction his father had gone, just as confused as he was at what had just happened. His mother though, held a terrifyingly familiar look. Her face was absolutely blank, the happy air around her evaporating like water on hot coal. The girls didn't know what to make of it when they saw Issei suddenly shrinking back, away from the woman he loved above almost everything else. Issei managed to swallow his fear, enough to try and speak. That look she had, it brought phantom pains of a day a long time ago. One he'd never forget and never wanted to repeat. Mom." Her eyes never moved, nor did her body. "Girls, please go get ready for school." Yui and Kaori were worried from the tone of her voice and the way it made Issei start to shake lightly, his eyes fixed on her back. The woman that sat before them was not the same warm and caring one they'd come to know and love. Right now, she was frigid, like she wanted nothing more than to cut all ties with everyone around her. The only thing they had to do was to grab their bags from upstairs. But there was no way they were about to disobey Hinoka Haidu right now. Leaving Issei to whatever fate was to befall him, they got up and went to sit in the guest room they'd taken over. Why are you afraid of this human, partner? Dragon tamer or not, your mother or not, she is nothing compared to you now. Drake had been woken up by the bombardment of fear coursing through his host. The red dragon was taking it easy the last few weeks, letting Alsha handle most aspects of his training. He would take over once things got serious, once there was an opponent that was worthy of his attention. Issei was also very attached to the previous host, for reasons Drake still didn't understand. The young man didn't answer, too shaken, and not willing to take his undivided attention away from his mother. Issei. He flinched as she spoke to him, more frightened right now than he had been in a long time. Yes, mother. Drake watched as his host slipped into a more distant and formal pattern than he'd seen since meeting Issei. It took more work on the dragon's part to be aware of the current surroundings, thanks to the bracelet. They had discovered that Fafnir's bracelet was only supposed to dull the senses, not completely turn them down to human levels. Being that Issei had first placed it on his left wrist, which was his dominant hand, it completely sealed him off. The boosted gear may be attached to his soul, but the power still originated from his left hand. Issei was not yet powerful enough to overcome the seals placed on the jewelry. But at least with it on his right wrist, Drake and Elsha could communicate with him if they just concentrated a bit harder. The heightened emotions of his host were helping Drake get past the magic. Sit. She pointed towards the chair his father had just vacated. Slowly, shakily, Issei complied. Once he did, his eyes stayed on the table. He heard his mother move and something coming to rest on the table, just out of view. Look at me. She had her elbow on the table, her fingers curled in except for her pinky finger. Issei felt his stomach drop as his heart felt like it would burst. He didn't want to do this. He loved it when he was a little kid because it made him feel like an adult. But now he felt like he was staring down a firing squad. It felt like he was moving in slow motion as he put his own hand on the table, ever so slowly linking his pinky with hers. His hand was sweating as she tightened their locked fingers together. Now, no lies, understood. He nodded weakly. Have you used the computer recently? His tongue was lead in his mouth as his body started to feel a case of vertigo come over it. Yes. Her eyes narrowed. When? Tuesday and Wednesday, for my econ paper. His mother linked their fingers together a little harder. Anything else? Issei shook his head no. This felt just like before. It was like she hated him all over again. Issei cleared his throat. There was a pop-up though, a full-screen one. He could see her jaw clench, obviously understanding. Be descriptive, but not vulgar. Issei had to wonder if her dragon tamer trait was making him even more afraid of disappointing her now, because it certainly felt that way. It was one of those webcam sites. The girl was dancing before she started taking off clothes. It was a loop video and started over when she was naked and laid on the bed. He could see her nostrils flaring a bit, she was very upset right now. Did you do anything that would bring that pop-up to our computer? Issei immediately shook his head. No mother. It was like his finger was being pressed in a vice right now as his mother seemed to develop supernatural strength. Do not lie to me. This would be the 4th time since you started high school, I'm sick of lies. She hissed. Hearing that from her was like a shot to the heart. Issei never wanted to lie to her if the situations weren't beyond normal human things. He really should have expected her to know he'd lied about the youth leader trip that was actually his training with Tannen. The others were small and inconsequential, but still he'd lied. He did know why his father was lashing out at him. And yes, it did hurt. His light body shaking returned and he couldn't maintain eye contact. I'm not lying. I closed it without clicking on anything else. I swear mother. He would pray, if it wouldn't cause him a migraine, that his mother wouldn't dig any deeper into anything else. Fine. He slowly let out the breath that he'd been holding onto. Where did you go for Golden Week? When he flinched, her grip became tighter, her other fist clenched. Issei stayed silent. He couldn't lie to her, so his only option was to not answer. They hadn't done this in a long time, but when he was 5 they agreed to only tell the truth during the pinky promise conversations. It was how she found out about him looking at porn in the first place, when he was a kid. Answer me. He wanted to. Issei wanted to tell her anything she wanted to know, but he was afraid of what would happen if she found out he'd become a creature that resided in the lake of fire, in hell. Mother please. But he couldn't, those were the rules as laid out by Sona. Humans couldn't be made aware of the supernatural unless they were affiliated in some way. You're my son. I have every right to know what it is you're doing, even more so if it's leading you down the wrong path. How do I know that you're not out there committing crimes when you say you're doing school functions? How do I know that the cops won't be here to arrest you for sexual harassment or rape? She exploded, both of their pinky fingers nearly turning blue from the force of her grip. Old habits die hard. Her husband had apparently been browsing the internet for naked young women again. Was she not good enough for him? Not attractive enough? Too old? Not willing to do whatever strange thing he was into? The anger brought about by his actions had quickly been shifted onto figuring out why her son had been lying to her about a few things. The underworld, Issei said quietly. Anoka Haidu stopped, looking at her son like he was crazy. Excuse me? Issei gathered the courage to look his mother in the eyes and tell her the truth. I went to the underworld, hell, during Golden Week. I was training to get stronger, to fight a devil. It was the truth, but he knew that without further context, it just sounded crazy. Get out. She threw his hand away from her, standing up violently, sending the chair down to the ground. Issei stared at her, wide-eyed. Her anger mixed with the frustration. Her eyes were becoming bloodshot as tears built up. Why? Her voice shook as she tried to hold it together just a bit longer. Why are you lying to me? What are you hiding? He heard the stairs creak, one or both of the girls must have been standing there. His mother didn't notice it and kept escalating into a frantic state. Is it drugs? Are you in a gang? Do the girls know? Is that why they all want to be with you? She covered her mouth with her hands, her voice was muffled by the shaky appendages. Is this payback for how awful I was to you? Because I beat you? Issei heard 2 gasps from the stairs. Then saw a flash of blue come from the living room. Issei might not hate every Monday. But he sure hated this one. Fear. Sona felt it flood her entire being, like nothing ever had. She had been stacking the evaluation forms with her queen, knight and rook when she nearly collapsed onto the floor. All 3 girls were by her side in an instant, helping her up. She couldn't focus on anything they might have been saying, instead trying to pinpoint what it was that had driven her pawn to such extremes so quickly. They even override the bracelet with such potency, she thought. When he had it on his right wrist, she knew that she'd only feel the bare minimum of their connection. Enough to know if he was safe or in danger, but that was it. The fear pulsing through him right now made it seem like he was being held against the point of a Seraph light spear. Standing on unsteady legs, Sona moved away from her peerage, ignoring them as they called out to her, and formed a circle a few feet from where she stood. She needed to get to him. The transportation circle didn't act the way Issei tried to rationalize it. It wasn't like the technique his favorite anime character could do. Instant transmission, or something like that. Sona had eventually gotten him to understand it by using one of the 2 video games she'd ever played for comparison. The short Italian plumber enters the tube through point A. Everything between him and point B is squished together like a vacuum-sealed bag to shorten the distance. Then he appears at the desired exit point. It wasn't the best explanation, but at the time, Sona didn't want to go into the details of dimensional travel. I wonder if sound echoes through it then. It was his attempt at making a stupid joke, but the fact of the matter is that sound does travel through. Sona stopped just before entering the circle to hear what was happening on the other side. During Golden Week. I was training to get stronger, to fight a devil. Her pawn's voice sounded like an echo in a metal chamber. But the unease in his tone was clear as day. The 4 devils in the room waited to hear what was next, as Sona had a suspicion of who he was talking to. She was hoping to be wrong. Why is Haidu revealing the supernatural? Tsubaki asked, her tone as even as it ever was. She had yet to call him by anything other than his last name. It wasn't because she didn't like him, Tsubaki told Sona in private that she was actually looking forward to getting to know him better as well. She just needed to get over her anxiety of dropping her guard around men. Tsubaki, Yura and Tomo looked to their king, waiting for an answer. Yay, he knows we have to keep it secret. Tomo added, rolling from her heels to her toes. The one in the room to spend the most time with him, however, stayed quiet. Yura didn't have the same connection with Issei that Momo and Reya did. She knew enough about him though to realize something wasn't right just by his tone. Get out. The breath was knocked from Sona's lungs as fear turned to pain. It wasn't physical pain, but she would have rather felt that compared to this emotional torture. Her pawn was experiencing an emotional rollercoaster. With her upbringing, Sona doubted she was even capable of feeling this way about her family. Her magic circle started to fade as her concentration was slipping away. Being the dutiful queen she was, Tsubaki took over and the circle flared back to life. How bad is it, Kaichu? Sona had fallen to one knee, slowly bringing herself back up with a hand on her desk. Crippling it was the only way to describe it. Sona was finding it hard to think, let alone do anything else. She needed to buck up and get to him. The bracelet was keeping at least half of the turmoil away from her, so she couldn't imagine that Issei was able to do anything but stare into the distance right now, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts and emotions. Why? Why are you lying to me? What are you hiding? Call Momo and Reya, get them here as soon as possible. I'm going alone. Sona declared firmly. Because things were already bad enough, adding new faces into the mix wouldn't make it easier. This was a mental battle, not physical, not magical. Is it drugs? Are you in a gang? Do the girls know? Is that why they all want to be with you? Tsubaki rose a brow at that part, wondering who his mother was talking about in her hysterical rant. Sona stepped into the circle, making it flash as she was transported to the home of her pawn. As the circle died, they heard his mother one more time. Is this payback for how awful I was to you? Because I beat you? But the king now gone, the queen took command, taking out her phone to call the two Sona had requested. Reya stared at where the circle was just a moment ago, concerned for her newest friend. She didn't know how bad things were on the other side. What she did know was that sometimes, a heated moment would leave you with nothing but a lifetime of regret. She hoped Issei wouldn't have to learn that, like she did. Hopefully Sona could prevent that from happening. Bring Momo and report back to the council office immediately. Tsubaki spoke into her phone, to Reya. The specifics aren't known yet. Haidu caused some sort of reaction with Kaichu, she's gone there to. Tsubaki was cut off, the other two girls turning to look at the queen. I see. The voice from the small speaker was muffled and incoherent for anyone else. No, I'm sure she has a plan. Just trust her. It was what they all needed to do. Sona Citri was nothing if not dedicated to the task she set for herself, they all knew that. Drag her to an alley and teleport out if you need to. Our king wanted you two here. I'm assuming she intends to bring Issei back with her, you can see him then. It was moments like this where someone wondered what kind of control one had over their life. Issei sat there in the kitchen with his mother, realizing how powerless he'd been to avoid this scenario. He felt frozen into the chair, paralyzed almost. It hadn't been him, but his father to bring his mother's wrath down upon him, however inadvertently. His lies hadn't been a product of his own accord, but the tale Sona had weaved for him to tell, at least the one his mom was asking about anyway. And so, because of one choice he made at the beginning of the school term, Issei sat and watched as his mother worked herself up more and more. The tears and heaving breaths of her being upset were offset by the rage displayed in her blazing eyes and clenched jaw. Where did he go from here? Telling the truth had done nothing but spin the situation further into its downward spiral. Lying would get him nowhere, he knew that. And now that Sona had appeared, as he could tell by the blue light in the living room and the slight flash of black hair he saw at the doorway, how would things change? Could his king help, or would her presence only make things worse? Well. His mother's voice was shaky, sorrow and rage at war with each other. There was slight pull at the air, so small that Issei didn't think his mother noticed it. It was then that Sona decided to make her presence known, rapping her knuckles against the frame of the entryway to the kitchen. The two Haidus turned to see her shift into full view at the doorway, her passive persona used in school present on her face. While Issei was slightly glad that she'd come to his aid, he didn't know how she'd become aware of the situation, he wondered if her cold facade would make things worse. His mother, however, began scrutinizing Sona intently, like a new piece of the puzzle had just revealed itself. Light brown, near copper eyes looked over every detail in seconds. Pardon me, Mrs. Haidu, but I believe I may be of assistance. Sona spoke clearly, keeping her eyes on the adult in the room. Crossing her arms, his mother had a tinge of that anger directed to the new arrival. And what brings you here? I don't believe I heard a knock on the door. She was assuming that Sona had just opened the door and walked inside like she owned the place. It didn't paint her in a positive light. The door was open. I came to retrieve Issei for our work this morning and felt it beneficial for me to intervene in your conversation. Sona answered immediately. So that was the pull in the air Issei felt, she must have magically opened the door because the thing creaked pretty loudly under normal circumstances. Beneficial how? Sona adjusted her glasses, taking a carefully hidden breath to calm herself. Issei noticed that she almost looked nervous. He didn't understand why that would be. Sona was a high-class devil and dealt with people far more fearsome than his mother. Well, in terms of physical attributes anyway, his mother could be quite intimidating when she wanted to be. Her emotions are affecting her. It's likely how she knew something was going on. Drake answered, surprising Issei. They had a harder time talking with the bracelet on, even if it were on his right wrist. It was possible, it just took a little more from each of them. But right now, Drake was coming through as clear as he would without it. Issei remembered then, being told that a sacred gear responds to emotion, and his were pretty potent at the moment. I heard you state that you were concerned over your son's activities as of late, that he might be involved in something illegal or immoral. I can assure you that he is not. Both mother and son gave the pure-blood devil a curious look. Issei, because he was curious about just what it was that she'd revealed to placate his mother. Mrs. Haidu, because some of the thoughts churning in her mind became her primary designation for this girl in front of her. That being, Sona Shitori was involved with whatever her son had been up to, possibly even being the one in charge. It fit in her mind perfectly, fitting the image she had of similar young women from her past. The cold and calculating types were always the ringleaders, stringing along someone else by offering them some long-desired dream. For her son, that would have unfortunately involved being around a mass of women. Preferably with the sex drive of a rabbit and the standards of any bottom-feeding organism. No. He's been getting better, I know that. Mrs. Haidu berated herself. It was her old habits creeping up again. And the two girls upstairs were around before all this mess started. She had no reason to think Issei was around these girls for that reason. Issei has been working for me, beginning shortly after he started Akuo Academy. I apologize in advance, for I am unable to share much of the details with you as of yet. Everyone involved is under a strict non-disclosure agreement. If you require any further proof of my claims, Kaori Murayama can provide it. This work is under the same umbrella corporation that her parents work for and is owned by my family. With widened eyes, the only adult in the room glanced between Sona and Issei. Her son looked as though he were ashamed, like he was a part of the life she had accused him of. But if what Sona said was true, then that just didn't seem possible. The company that Kaori's parents worked for had the cleanest record of pretty much any major organization in the medical field. They were clear and concise in what practices they were a part of. Each and every product worked for its designated use, as described. This led to thoughts on her voiced concerns. If he's working for the same group, why did he come home all scraped up during Golden Week? The Bridgewater Corporation is mainly medical groups and research-based companies. She knew that because the company had been in several news segments going on about global expansion over the last decade and how they were among the most successful after such an explosive growth period. Adjusting her glasses, Sona glanced at her pawn, who was looking at her like a savior delivered before the final blow claimed his life. Given the particulars of the relationship of this mother and son, that may have been close to the truth. Again, Mrs. Haidu, due to the nature of the standard agreement used in each beginning venture, there isn't much I can tell you. Her violet eyes locked onto his mother, looking as professional as any business person found in the higher tiers of corporate society. Mrs. Haidu realized one thing then. She was right to think that Sona was the leader, but she had made a miscalculation. This young woman did not act this way due to her own actions and lessons. It was something bred into her by her family. The elite made sure they stayed elite. The child of such a family would be taught to act in a way to keep their secrets in the dark, read people they might do business with. That cold and calculating persona was through no fault of her own, but her parents'. The gaze behind rimmed glasses softened slightly, struggling to not shift towards Issei. Mrs. Haidu had another thought, this one regarding the conversation with Yui the other day. The sixth girl was now identified. But I know how much your son cares for you and strives to hold to the standard of honesty you instilled in him. There isn't much I can tell you, but here is what I can. Mrs. Haidu was sure of it now. Sona may not be as far along as the two girls living in her home or those two student council girls, but the young woman in front of her was at the very least interested. She would find out the how and why of these developing relationships her son had. Your son is helping me to establish an educational facility that will be the first of its kind. The richest of the rich or the poorest of the poor, everyone will have the chance to attend. There will be physical, academic, and spiritual education on par with the most prestigious facilities. The female devil turned stone cold serious as she finished. This is why you haven't been made aware of what your son is doing. The implications of what we will be doing will affect a great deal of individuals. If word spread to the wrong people, it would undermine everything I've done to achieve this goal. Allow me to also address any issues of compensation as well. As a working minor and a high school student, this is a concern our company has been adamant we stay within local and federal law. The main payment agreed upon was a performance-based stipend to be paid nearing the end of his contract. However, Issei has been performing above our initial hopes and has recently been approved a bonus of sorts. Mrs. Haidu could recall a few brief conversations with Ice about what he might want to do once he was done with school, and teaching was on that list. To hear that he was already actively participating in that very goal made her heart swell with pride. She just wished that there wasn't this secrecy around it. And what form does this bonus take? She asked, still minimally suspicious that there might be some less than appropriate payments given to her son. She was proud of the progress he had made in bettering himself, but as she could attest to, old habits die hard. Those urges would likely always be there for him. Her son had perked up as well, wanting to hear how he was being rewarded. Issei was also wondering how he had gone above and beyond her expectations of him. The Bridgewater Corporation will pay for his education at Kuo Academy in full. The payment you made will be refunded to you within the week. This is due to the limits placed on minors in terms of compensation and the taxes they would have to pay. All work-related expenses will be paid by me upfront. He will not have to worry about any sort of reimbursement process. That was a great help actually. The promotion Koji received certainly made paying for the school easier, but there was still a strain placed on them due to the renovations on their home that were still being paid for. Speaking of Koji, she had just the person to ask about a certain topic right in front of her. I'll reveal it, what kind of person is she? The turn in the conversation had Sona raising an eyebrow. Why do you ask? There were a few less than innocent ways Hinoka Haidu could answer that. Her suspicions had yet to be absolutely confirmed yet, but the dots were nearly connected already, thanks to the back-forth of Issei and Koji. I have a good suspicion that your student body president has been participating in activities not in line with your school's guidelines. And if it turned out to be true, she prayed to any and all deities that Issei stayed far away from her. Surely Yui and Kaori would help with that. Once the four of them were outside, Issei, Yui and Kaori saw Sona take a deep breath, her shoulders easing as she released it. Issei felt similar, they had defused a bad situation that was primed and ready to get worse. It was still a little early for the kendo girls to be heading out, but they thought it best to leave with Issei after the events that had just passed. Each of the three girls knew that he might need a shoulder to lean on right now, with how attached to his mother Issei was. "Aichu, was that true, what you said in there?" Issei asked, as he felt the tension of the morning easing from himself also. He wasn't sure if his mother was serious about him leaving, but he really didn't want to find out. "It was a subject I had yet to talk to you about. As a member of my peerage, your tuition is paid for by me. If you wanted to get a doctorate in physics, I would pay for it all." She knew that Issei was not likely to pursue anything past a bachelor's degree, but the offer would always be there. Devils had long lifespans, so there was always the chance that he could go back to school in a few centuries, and she wanted to make it known that she supported that decision. "Thank you. My dad makes decent money, but I know paying for Kuo was putting some strain on them." Issei got quiet for a few more seconds, but had his eyes locked onto Sona as they walked. Yui and Kaori saw an amount of admiration coming from him that they wished had been on them instead. "And for helping me out back there, I really can't thank you enough." Sona gave him a small smile, saying that it was no problem. The walk to Kuo was a silent one, but the Citri heiress's mind was turning to berating herself. Strategy was her strong suit, thinking ahead to keep things from going out of her control. Yet having Issei in her peerage was proving how much she truly had left to improve. When her suspicions had been confirmed about his mother, she should have worked on plans for things like the altercation this morning. But she hadn't. What were the odds of a member of her peerage being partially turned dragon, and then his mother having dragon tamer traits? They were laughable at best. So abysmally small that Sona had written it off as impossible. And when it turned out that was exactly the case, she had done nothing with that information. Issei had already been pretty attached to his mother, from what she'd gathered. His new situation had only exacerbated it. The tales of a dragon being pushed away by the tamer they bond with never had happy endings. Death and destruction was the usual result. Sona had almost let her own actions tear her plans apart. What I wouldn't give to had Reya's mental manipulation aptitude. She thought, waiting for the crosswalk to give them the sign to cross. Instead of building up that ability, Sona had spent time learning negotiation tactics. She wanted to follow her family's footsteps, using words and reputation to get what she wanted. Magical coercion was not what she wanted to use in order to achieve her goals. But there was no denying that the skill would have been helpful this morning. Calling Reya's probably would have taken too long as well, with what her friend had revealed this morning. That was yet another thing put on her plate. Now she would need to get Issei in front of Lord Beelzebub to see if his pieces were acting up. No peerage member had ever been recorded as able to draw upon the master's family trait, like Issei had yesterday. It was time she switched tactics, like she'd been planning to do. Her pawn's training had been primarily power-focused for the next few weeks, until she would hopefully set him to train with Tiamat, she would guide him in strategy. This would also have the added bonus of prepping him for one of her initial steps that she told Reya of. She was going to teach Issei chess strategies. Now that things were at least somewhat dealt with at the Haidu home, Sona was going to turn her attention to something Mrs. Haidu brought up. Was the president of her school's student council posting adult-oriented videos of herself while wearing the uniform? There was little she could do about that damned woman doing it in general, but using the Kuo uniform was absolutely not going to fly. That damned succubus is too good at giving me migraines. To say the atmosphere in the clubroom was strange would be underselling it by a large amount. It was clear to everyone that something had happened yesterday between Reya's and the only pawn in the Citri group. When Akeno had tried to tease it out of her king, Reya's had blushed so hard that she couldn't speak before running away. That was odd, Reya's was not the type to shy away. She had walked around the clubroom completely naked, with her, Kaneko and Kiba present, and hadn't even bat an eye. Whatever happened, it must have been very intimate. If she didn't know Reya's better, she'd say that her friend had thrown caution to the wind and had sex with him. She had tried catching the young man in the first-year hallway on several of the breaks between classes, but hadn't seen him at all. She had seen those two kendo girls, but they didn't seem to like her for some reason. Their faces had gone from glaring to sadly introspective. Something had most definitely happened over the last 24 hours, and not all of it good, she gathered. Placing the tea tray on the table, Akeno tried her luck in a different way, playing the worried senior card. Has anyone seen Issei today? Her question was mainly directed towards Kiba, since they were in the same year, but if she could get something out of Reya's, she'd be happy and work with it. Kiba shook his head. I haven't. Normally I see him on the way back from lunch, but he wasn't there at the time. Reya's blushed a little bit, but not nearly as much as she had this morning. She fidgeted in her chair behind the desk. That's a shame, I was hoping we could get to know him a bit. I looked for him today and didn't see him either. Reya's blushed harder. What happened between you two yesterday? Akeno wondered. It was starting to really get under her skin that her friend was being so tight-lipped about the whole date. She hadn't shared a single blip about the entire day. We're better off without him. Kaneko spoke, picking up a Rice Krispie treat from her mound of candy. Akeno had to fight her eyes from widening as Reya's actually glared at the small rook. Whatever it was, you liked it. She thought with a snicker. Reya's was very protective over those she cared for. Issei had done something right yesterday, that much was clear to her now. I don't know about that, Kaneko. Sona says that he's about as strong as I am now. At this rate, he'll be our ace in the hole for getting Reya's free. Kaneko swallowed her sugary treat before retorting. Yeah, just to have another guy who only wants to get her naked. Reya's turned her chair to face away from them, but not before Akeno caught the absolutely atomic red blush all over her face. Oh yes, Issei saw more than just a bit of cleavage yesterday. Akeno was going to have a very good time finding out what happened and then teasing Reya's with it for months. I wonder what that would be like, dating a younger guy. I've heard some whispers about how he treats the girls close to him, and I have to admit that I'm a bit curious. Akeno Reya's cut her off. Her tone was obviously meant to be stern, but there was a waver in it that all could hear. The orc members could all see the blush that had crept up the neck of their king. My date with Ice was fine. We walked around and shopped a bit, had lunch, and then went to a manga shop where I found a gift for my nephew. My goal was to get to know him better, and that's what happened. Akeno peered at her king intently, looking for some subtle sign, something to say what else had happened. Reya's was silently telling her to back off, to stop prying. Akeno gave a small bow of her head, but the teasing smile never left. Reya's wouldn't be able to hold out forever, whatever happened was going to come out eventually. Would you go out with him again? Kiba spoke up as he picked up the book he'd been reading for the last few days. Akeno waited as Reya seemed to carefully consider her response, even Kaneko seemed interested in what their master would say. At some point, yes. We both have busy schedules, so a second date will probably have to wait a while. That was when Akeno figured something had to have embarrassed Reya's. Other than school work or stray hunts, the orc really didn't do much. She could see Issei claiming a busy schedule with his training, student council work, and the kendo club. But besides a few meetings here and there, Reya's usually did as she pleased when she had free time. Other than the overly affectionate way her brother doted on her, Reya's was not embarrassed by much. It made her all the more eager to speak with him. The perception of passing time is a strange thing. For Issei, it had become more noticeable over the last 10 days. From the time he woke up until leaving for school, seconds seemed everlasting. While he was on school grounds, it seemed to be the reverse, and the sun would be setting in the blink of an eye. The source of which was obviously the confrontation he had caused. Breg had berated him for the submission he'd shown to his mother. A dragon does not bow. Issei wondered if that was a big part of the mentality that got him and Albion sealed in the first place. If the two dragons had been more conscious of what had been going on around them, they might still have their own bodies. Queen's Gambit. Issei guessed. Sona had given him a day free of any responsibilities and then changed tactics. She was teaching him chess strategies to help him see beyond the current move an opponent was making. Since the day Sona teleported in, she'd been much more attentive to him. Every morning so far, his king had asked about the mood at home. Every day she asked, he gave the same answer. Tense and quiet. His mother seemed torn on how to feel. She wasn't cold to him, like she had been before his reform, but she didn't initiate any conversation. It was apparent that she was still upset over him lying to her, but now she had an adequate enough reason for the deception. Sona had provided some documentation about his employment, with a promise for full disclosure once phase 1 was completed. Close, but no. Teresh. Sona reset the board and tried another, testing how much her pawn was retaining. He understood the game well enough. How the pieces moved had only taken a few minutes. But anything more than just reacting was coming slowly. The relationships with his friends had taken a small turn as well. Yui and Kaori had started alternating which of them climbed into his bed now. Momo and Reya had deemed that he needed to be pressured a little bit more. Each and every kiss had a tongue slipped in now. Reya would occasionally slide a hand over his crotch for an extra measure of torture. Oddly enough, Yui and Kaori didn't react the way they used to, they simply eyed him for a moment and then continued with the day. How about this one? Sona had placed a knight, pawn and rook out onto the field for the white side, with a pawn and knight beside each other for the black. Issei found himself glancing up from the board more than he meant to. He couldn't help it, Sona's violet eyes just had a way of drawing him in. No matter how many times he told himself to keep the thoughts away, if they were in close proximity for long enough, he'd remember that dream from when they first met. Hori attack. He answered without looking back to the board. He loved Yui and Kaori, had admitted it to himself and to one of them, but when Sona smiled at him, it was like the problems of the world vanished. He had to shake his head to remember where he was and what he was doing. Kings don't get into relationships with servants. Just like oil and water, they can be close, but they never mix. It was safer not to go down that road. Very good Issei. Even though it felt like his brain was going to melt, Issei felt that he had to keep putting everything into his training. Sona told him that they'd have to eventually fill in his parents about his reincarnation. When that day came, Issei wanted to be able to show his parents that he would make something of himself. When she reset the board, Sona stood from the couch on the opposite side of the table in her office. She was not as developed as Momo, Reya or Murayama, but watching her take that deep breath and the movements because of it were still captivating. "I'm never going to kick this breast fetish, am I?" he asked, more to himself than to either voices residing in his head. "I don't see the problem with appreciating them, so long as you can keep yourself under control." While Elsha didn't seem to find issue with his lingering eyes, Drake was another matter. "You should keep your mind on the training and not on watching a woman's chest. Once you've won your battle, then you'll have earned a reward." Issei couldn't argue with either one's logic. As long as he kept his head in the game, a little peek here and there wouldn't hurt anything. It wasn't like he was being left completely deprived either. Yui had a habit of holding his hand to her chest while she slept now. Her nightgown was often found mostly unbuttoned by morning, giving him full view of those perky mounds. "It's time that you and I talked about a few things, Issei," Sona said, bringing him back to the situation at hand. She had moved to sit at her desk, her serious persona fully in place. With a gesture of her hand, she told Issei to sit across from her. "Sure thing, what about?" he asked, taking the seat and shifting to get comfortable. It sounded like this might take a while. Sona steepled her hands on the desk, a move Issei had come to associate with matters that were important and required her full attention. "While I usually agree with keeping family issues within said family, you are a part of my family now. I'm sorry for the disturbance that occurred because of our current president. But I have to ask you to clarify some of the things I and the other heard your mother say." Issei wilted, knowing where this was most likely going. It wasn't a pleasant memory, and not just because of the physical pain from that day. It hurt to think of it because in that moment, he hadn't felt like his mother had cared about his well-being at all. Even now, that day gave him the impression that he was expendable in her eyes. It was stupid, and he knew that it wasn't true. But it didn't matter how much he corrected his thoughts after the fact, that initial feeling had always remained. "It was years ago, when I was 11, and that was the only time." He started before she had even truly asked. Sona sat back in her chair, ready to listen to the events. "My mom had already been angry because she found magazines in my room. She went to go look online for a recipe and the computer was filled with pictures. She just figured that I was the one who did it." Sona bounced one leg over the other, trying to ease the uncomfortable feeling radiating to her. Issei really didn't want to talk about this. "So she hit you?" It wasn't a question, as she'd heard his mother admitted. Issei nodded. "Was it one strike?" He shook his head. "How many times?" That uncomfortable feeling grew as Issei hesitated to answer for a moment. "I don't know." Issei snapped his mouth shut before he said anything more. He didn't want to build any animosity between the people in his life. And saying that he was pretty sure the pain had knocked him out would not make anything better. "Was it with her hand?" Issei was really starting to wish she would drop the topic. But he still shook his head no. If she asked, he would tell her, but he wasn't about to offer up everything. "The belt? What part of the belt needn't be mentioned? Any injuries?" "No, just a few red marks." And wasn't that surprising? By all logic, he should have been cut and bruised, with a broken rib or two from that. Issei counted himself lucky that he was of a sturdier build. Sona could feel the apprehension on this topic and it was making her stomach twist. He was hiding something, but she couldn't tell what. His mother was going to be an important figure in his life, so she would just have to keep an eye out for any outbursts like that, not for his physical safety, but his mental stability. "Okay, next topic." She could see and feel Issei relax, and it was like she could breathe comfortably again. "How do you feel about Reya's?" The complete change in the mood of this conversation left him mentally unbalanced for a second. He wasn't sure what kind of response she was looking for here. Was she asking what he personally felt about her as a person or as a devil? "Let me try a different approach. Reya's told me what happened in that manga shop." Sona raised a hand to stop whatever Issei was going to say in his defense. She understood that his background would have it seeming like he'd somehow coerced her to do it. "What happened was no fault of yours, not directly. You channeled something that by all knowledge shouldn't have been possible. It is very likely to comply." Sona stopped when a blue circle appeared next to her ear. Issei watched and waited as his king listened to the voice on the other end. She had seemed a bit frustrated by the interruption, at least at first. When her expression became more serious than he was used to, he wondered what was being said. "It will be done and reported upon completion." Sona closed the circle, with a flash of irritation on her face. Without preamble, Sona switched gears to the more important issue at hand. Go home, eat well and get some rest. I had hoped to better prepare you, but tonight will be your first stray hunt. Tsubaki will come to you once we're all ready, expect her around midnight. End of the part 8. So how was this story? I hope you like it. And if you like it, share this story with your friends and like the video too. And don't forget to subscribe our channel for daily awesome fanfiction. Okay, it's time for me to go. Bye bye.